I never thought my grandmother's language would become the weapon that would destroy my marriage. Or maybe it became the shield that finally protected me. I'm still not sure which. It started the week after her funeral. I was alone in our penthouse when I found her old recipe book tucked inside my suitcase. The margins were filled with notes in Spanish, reminders, prayers, fragments of the life she'd lived before dementia stole her words. I told myself I'd just translate one page, just one. Before we continue with the story, be sure to subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. Oh, and drop a comment below, letting us know where you're watching from. We love seeing that 6 months later, I'd worked through the entire book and started online classes. For 3 years, I kept it secret. It felt sacred somehow, like a private conversation with a ghost I couldn't let go. My husband Brian would come home to find me reviewing auction catalogs or entertaining his business associates, never knowing I'd spent my afternoon conjugating verbs with a tutor on a burner laptop. I learned Spanish through whispered repetition first, then found myself understanding the household staff's conversations, catching phrases from the gardeners outside. Eventually, I started working with a private instructor twice a week when Brian traveled, practicing pronunciation in the wine cellar where no one could hear me. I never told anyone. Not Brian, not his mother Anita, not even my sister in Portland. It was my private rebellion, my escape from the suffocating performance of being Mrs. Brian Sewell, the art restorer turned trophy wife, whose opinions on Baroque paintings mattered less than her ability to wear Valentino at charity galas. Then Anita arrived for her monthly inspection weekend. She'd never quite accepted me, though she maintained the polished civility expected in their circles. We'd just finished the autumn fundraiser, a $50,000 a plate dinner for the museum expansion, and I'd excused myself to supervise the catering team when I heard them slip into the library, speaking in that easy, unguarded way people do when they think they're invisible. "So, you finally decided about the trust?" Anita asked. Her voice carried that particular sharpness mothers use when they're protecting an empire, not a son. Brian's response made my hand freeze on the dessert menu. "Yes. The twins turn 6 months next week. My attorney says we can establish the secondary trust without raising questions." The portfolio I was holding nearly slipped. I pressed it against the doorframe, forcing myself to keep my expression blank even though they couldn't see me. My pulse hammered against my collarbone so hard I thought the pearls might rattle. "And Clara suspects nothing?" Anita pressed, her tone laced with something between concern and contempt. "Nothing. She barely notices what happens below the 3rd floor." His mother's voice dropped lower. "This situation with the girl with Marisol, it's delicate. The child support alone could expose—" "I have it under control," Brian interrupted with the supreme confidence of a man who'd never been caught at anything. "Clara will never find out. She doesn't even speak to the staff beyond please and thank you." I stepped back from the doorway as quietly as the marble floors would allow, though the rushing sound in my ears made everything feel muffled and distant. My reflection in the hallway mirror stared back at me. Hair perfectly styled, dress perfectly pressed, smile perfectly absent. I recognized the words, understood every devastating syllable, but my brain felt like it was watching someone else's life collapse. 6 months old. Secondary trust. She doesn't even speak to the staff. I walked back into the ballroom with the same serene expression I'd perfected through 1,000 donor dinners and foundation galas. The caterers looked up expectantly. "Everything's perfect," I said smoothly. "Let's serve the panna cotta." Brian found me an hour later as the last guests filtered out, pulling me close in that performative way he did when his mother was watching. You were incredible tonight. Absolutely flawless. Anita's gaze met mine over his shoulder, lingering just long enough to search for cracks in my facade. I smiled at her with the warmth of expensive wine and gave her a small, gracious nod. She returned it slowly, her eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly, as if trying to decide whether her secret was still safe. The next morning, after Anita's driver took her back to Greenwich, Brian kissed my forehead while adjusting his tie. "My mother thinks you're finally growing into the role," he said, like it was a compliment. "She told me you're exactly what the Sewell family needs." "I'm glad she approves," I replied softly, already planning my first call to the forensic accountant, whose card I'd kept hidden in a book about Spanish Baroque painters. The decision crystallized in that moment, sharp and clear as the diamonds on my finger. I wouldn't confront him. Not yet. Not until I knew every account, every shell company, every lie he'd built. Not until I had documentation that would survive any legal team his family could buy. 3 years of restoring damaged paintings had taught me something Brian never understood. Some things are beyond repair, and the only thing worth saving was myself. The library was the only room in the house that still smelled like someone else's life. Old paper, beeswax polish, the faint ghost of cigar smoke trapped in the velvet drapes from a generation of Sewells who had discussed railroads and oil and hostile takeovers in leather chairs while women waited elsewhere. Tonight, the women waited here. I slipped in to escape the gala noise, the clink of crystal and the orchestral swell drifting from the ballroom. My heels sank into the thick Persian rug, muffling my steps. The lights were low, the shelves glowing amber, and the velvet curtain that framed the bay window hung heavy enough to hide a person who knew how to disappear. I'd had years of practice. I was halfway to the decanter Brian kept on the sideboard when I heard Anita's voice in the hallway, sharp and close. I ducked behind the curtain without thinking, silk catching on velvet, heart stuttering against my ribs. The door opened. Their footsteps crossed the rug. "Necesito que seas claro, Brian," she said. "I need you to be clear." My lungs forgot how to work for a beat. "Spanish, here." With the certainty of someone who believed no one listening could understand. Brian exhaled, a soft, practiced sigh. "Mamá, ya está decidido. Los gemelos serán los nuevos herederos Sewell. The twins will be the new Sewell heirs." The words landed like a slap. I pressed my back to the cold glass, fingers digging into the curtain. In the ballroom beyond the wall, someone laughed too loudly. Ice chimed in a glass. The string quartet slid into another waltz. In the library, my world quietly tipped. "The Maid'S children?" Anita's heels clicked once as she shifted. "You are risking everything for a scandal downstairs." "Marisol is not the risk," he replied, voice low and annoyed. "The risk is if anyone learns, they're mine." The curtain brushed my cheek as I leaned closer, my body moving before my mind caught up. Mine. I tasted metal at the back of my throat. "And Clara?" Anita asked. "Your wife believes she will give this family an heir. What happens when she realizes she was only ever decor?" My fingers curled around the velvet so tightly the pile bit into my skin. I kept my breathing shallow, controlled. For years, I'd stood beside Brian as an ornament he'd polished for nights exactly like this. No one ever asked what I heard while I smiled. "She won't realize anything," Brian said. "Clara doesn't speak to the staff, much less their language. She's comfortable, that's her value. Comfortable." The word slid over me like a diagnosis. Anita hummed, dissatisfied. "If those children are taking the Sewell name, your affairs must be clean. The trusts, the shares. No loose ends." "They'll be handled," he answered. By the time anyone thinks to look, it will be done. A server knocked, asking if they needed anything. Chairs scraped, fabric rustled. My pulse pounded so loudly I was sure they could hear it. "Regresemos al baile," Anita said. "Let's return to the ball." The door closed behind them. I stayed where I was, pressed between glass and velvet, until the rushing in my ears thinned and the music seeped back into focus. The twins, the maid, heirs. My husband's voice, so calm, rearranging the future of a family as if I were not already wearing its name. Then I smoothed my dress, fixed my lipstick in the reflection of the window pane, and stepped out from behind the curtain, already rehearsing the smile I would wear while my world quietly burned. The contract was printed on paper so thick it felt like arrogance between my fingers. Heavy, cream, engraved with Brian's attorney's letterhead. A document designed to outlive feelings, intention, even memory. I sat at my desk in the smaller study, the one he called your little office, and read every line as if I were examining a forged canvas for cracks. There were plenty, none that favored me. The prenup did exactly what it was built to do: protect the Sewell fortune from emotional weather. It capped my settlement, defined marital property in a way that turned everything meaningful into his separate asset, and carved out what would happen if we divorced for irreconcilable differences. That elegant phrase meant, even if you're miserable, you leave quietly with what we have pre-approved. I traced the paragraph that mattered most, the one I had skipped in the flush of engagement when the ring was still blinding and I believed in his version of forever. Infidelity alone was not enough to void the agreement. Proof of ongoing fraud, reputational risk to the family name, and conduct detrimental to the Sewell legacy were the real landmines. He'd assumed those were his weapons. I set the contract down and leaned back, staring at the ceiling moldings Brian's architect had insisted were historically accurate. Restoration had taught me that what looks original often isn't. It just mimics the past, convincingly enough to pass under casual inspection. The marriage contract was no different. On the surface, I was safeguarded. Under light, I was disposable. Infidelity, fraud, legacy. In the quiet of the study, the memory of his voice in the library replayed, each word in Spanish now a brushstroke on a very different canvas. Twins, heirs, secondary trust, child support hidden as something else. He wasn't just a cheating husband. He was an artist of concealment. And concealment, I knew, left residue. I opened my laptop, not the one his IT team managed, but the slim, unremarkable machine I used for side projects, and created a new folder. I named it Restoration Sewell. It looked innocuous, like an exhibition proposal. Inside, I began a list. Shell companies, trusts, Marisol's employment contract, the law firm that handled family matters, the banker who'd once flirted with me at a gala and slipped his card into my clutch. Proof, documentation, leverage. For years, my job had been to bring damaged masterpieces back to their intended glory, to clean away layers of smoke and varnish until the original truth emerged. I had done the same with Brian. Polished his image, framed his narrative, made excuses for his cracks. Now the project shifted. I would treat our life as a painting slated not for restoration, but for deaccession. Every secret account, every falsified invoice, every payment disguised as art acquisition would be cataloged and photographed in my mind. I would reconstruct the story his attorneys never wanted a judge to see. The prenup wasn't a cage. It was a blueprint. It told me exactly which beams I had to weaken to bring the structure down. Down the hall, I heard Brian's laugh echo from his office as he spoke to someone on speakerphone, relaxed, invincible. He thought the deal of our life, had already been made, signed, sealed, archived. At my desk, I picked up a pen and wrote the first line of my own terms. The restoration has begun. Marisol was polishing the silver when I found her, each motion precise, economical, as if she were afraid to leave fingerprints on anything that might be counted later. The nursery monitor sat beside her on the sideboard, its soft green light blinking in a steady rhythm. Somewhere upstairs, one of the twins let out a thin, sleepy cry. "I can take that," I said, nodding toward the monitor. She startled, then straightened, wiping her hands quickly on her apron. "No, senora, it's fine. They sleep light." Her English was formal, careful. Her eyes didn't quite meet mine. I moved closer, pretending to study the shine on the platter. "You've been working so hard. The boys look strong." I chose the word because it felt neutral. Safe. "Gracias." The corners of her mouth lifted, then fell again. "They are good babies." I heard everything she didn't say. They are good babies. Not our babies, not his. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint clatter of staff in the back hallway, the distant murmur of Brian on a phone call upstairs, all of it pressed around us. The house had never felt so crowded with silence. "You must miss your family," I said softly. "Back home." Her fingers tightened around the cloth. "My mother sends videos. My little brother plays with the babies on the screen." She shrugged, a small, helpless lift of her shoulders. "Work here is better." Better than what? I didn't ask. Our reflections hovered together in the glass of the cabinet door, my tailored dress, her plain uniform, the same tiredness etched in different currencies. I realized with a strange, disorienting clarity that I had never really looked at her before. Not beyond noting that she was young, pretty, efficient. Brian had hired her, said the agency recommended her, and I had simply trusted the system that handed her to us like another service. "Marisol," I said, letting her name sit between us. "If you ever need anything, if you feel unsafe, you can come to me." Her eyes flicked up then, dark and startled. For a second, something raw flashed across her face. Fear, shame, calculation, all tangled together. "I'm fine, senora," she replied quickly, too quickly. "Mr. Sewell, he is generous." The way she said his name, not Brian, never Brian, turned my stomach. Generous, the word that men like him used to disguise ownership. I switched languages, without warning. ¿Él fue generoso antes o después de los bebés? Was he generous before or after the babies? The cloth slipped from her hand. Her breath hitched, so quietly I might have missed it if I hadn't spent years listening for the things no one said out loud. Color drained from her face, then flooded back in a hot, blotchy blush. "You habla español," she whispered, the grammar fractured by shock. "A veces," I answered. "Sometimes." We stared at each other, two women standing on opposite sides of an invisible line neither of us had drawn. I saw it now with brutal clarity. The power imbalance, the way Brian's charm would have felt like opportunity to someone whose visa depended on his signature. The way consent blurred when your employer controlled your salary, your housing, your ability to stay in the country. "He said..." Her voice cracked, and she bit it off, pressing her lips together. When she spoke again, she'd stitched herself back into formality. "Él dijo que usted sabía, que estaba bien." He said you knew, that it was fine. The room tilted, just slightly. Of course he had. He hadn't just betrayed me. He'd used me as cover, my existence, my last name, my ring. All of it a shield he'd held up while he stepped into her room downstairs. I didn't know, I said. And it isn't fine. Tears gathered in her eyes, held there by sheer will. If I lose this job. She didn't finish the sentence, but I could see the rest. No childcare, no apartment, no money for her mother's medicine back home. For the first time since the library, the rage that had been burning cold inside me shifted, widened, made room for something else. He hadn't just broken our marriage. He'd built his comfort on the fear of a girl who had run out of choices. This is not your fault, I told her. None of this is your fault. She shook her head, not in disagreement, but in disbelief that anyone in this house might say those words to her. From upstairs, one of the twins began to cry in earnest. The monitor crackled. I will go, she murmured, reaching for it. I touched her wrist. Take care of them, I said. I'll take care of him. For a heartbeat, she searched my face, as if trying to decide whether to trust the woman who had been smiling beside her captor for years. Whatever she saw there seemed to be enough. She nodded once, then hurried out, apron fluttering behind her. Left alone in the quiet kitchen, I stared at the silver tray she'd been polishing. My reflection warped across its surface. Two versions of myself overlapping. The obedient wife and the woman who now understood she was not the only one Brian had turned into collateral. The deal I was making in my head shifted then. It was no longer just about my settlement, my escape. It was about the cost he had assigned to every woman in his orbit. The restoration wouldn't end with my frame. The first clue came disguised as beauty. I was in the main office, cataloging pieces for an insurance appraisal Brian had requested for the auditors, when an invoice caught my eye. A contemporary painting I didn't recognize, listed at $380,000. Gallery name familiar, artist vaguely known. Except I knew every work that entered this house, every canvas that crossed my work table, every crate that passed through our loading bay. This painting had never been here. I pulled the file. There were photos attached, a high-resolution image of a large abstract piece, all bruised blues and violent streaks of white. It looked like something a hedge fund manager would hang above a fireplace to prove he had feelings. I checked the storage log. No crate, no delivery signature, no conservation notes. The painting existed only on paper. The gallery had been paid in full. I followed the payment trail to a newly formed LLC with a bland, forgettable name, Serrano Holdings. It lived in the same digital neighborhood as other Sewell entities, tucked one layer deeper, like a brushstroke added to correct a mistake. Serrano Holdings wired funds to the gallery. The gallery sold the painting. Serrano Holdings recorded an asset. Except there was no asset. Just money moving, wearing art as its mask. My stomach tightened. I searched Serrano Holdings again. More invoices populated the screen. Consulting fees, shipping charges, storage costs. Most were modest. One stood out. Monthly payments labeled Auxiliary Curatorial Services, all for the same recipient. A personal account under Marisol's full name. Not a check from payroll. Not routed through the household staff system. A direct transfer from a shell company that, on paper, existed to manage art. Child support, I whispered. Not written anywhere, of course. But the pattern was unmistakable. Every payment date fell within a week of his supposed gallery trips or board meetings. The amounts rose after the twins were born, buffered with occasional art scouting reimbursements large enough to cover rent twice over. For years, I had believed art in this house was about taste, legacy, curation. Brian had simply discovered that art was the perfect laundering language. No one questioned six-figure sums if they were attached to the right gallery letterhead. I printed the ledger, the invoices, the corporate registration documents. Each sheet slid from the machine warm and thin, so unlike the thick, arrogant paper of our prenup. I tucked them into a plain manila folder and labeled it with a date, nothing more. It went into the Restoration Sewell archive, alongside screenshots and notes written in my careful, museum-perfect hand. This wasn't just adultery now. It was financial choreography, fraud twirling in time with wire transfers and tax write-offs, all of it dancing on the backs of 2 infants and a woman who apologized every time she took a day off. I stared at the screen a moment longer, watching the cursor blink over the last transaction. The number glowed cold and unapologetic. Brian thought he'd hidden his sins in the language of acquisitions and provenance. He'd forgotten that I was the one who authenticated value for a living. The twins' nursery had been designed to look like a magazine spread. Muted wallpaper, floating bookshelves, a mobile that cost more than my first car. In the soft afternoon light, it all looked impossibly gentle, as if ugliness couldn't reach this far up the house. I knocked anyway. Marisol turned from the changing table, surprise flickering across her face before she masked it with the same polite reserve she wore downstairs. One of the boys lay on his back, kicking at the air, cheeks flushed with sleep. The other was curled in the crib, a pacifier bobbing rhythmically between his lips. "I hope I'm not interrupting," I said, lowering my voice. I realized I haven't been up here nearly enough. That's my fault, not yours. She shook her head quickly. "No, Senora. You are very busy." Busy. It was such a generous word for the kind of curated emptiness my days had become. I stepped closer to the crib, letting my hands hover over the railing. The baby's hair was a soft, dark wave, his skin the warm tone that fell between mine and Brian's. If anyone ever asked, it would be easy to lie. Genetics were creative. The Sewell press team would spin it into a charming story about inherited dimples and destiny. "They're beautiful," I murmured. That part was true. Marisol's expression softened, pride slipping through her caution. "Sigh. They eat well now. Sleep, sometimes. You must be exhausted." I turned toward her. "I came to talk about that, actually. I've been thinking we should bring in a night nurse a few times a week, give you a chance to rest." Her eyes widened. A night nurse? That is too much. "It's appropriate." I poured warmth into my tone, the way Anita did when she wanted to make a command sound like kindness. "You're doing the work of 3 people. It's my responsibility to support you." She hesitated, caught between suspicion and desperate relief. "If you think it is best." "I do." I smiled. "And there's an agency I trust. They'll need some information, medical, schedules, feeding habits. I thought I'd help with the paperwork, if you don't mind." I reached for the clipboard hanging by the dresser, flipping through the forms I'd had sent over. In reality, I'd printed them myself. A mashup of real intake documents and carefully worded additions about optional health screenings and genetic markers that could be covered by the Sewell Wellness Fund. All completely voluntary, all written to sound like an extra layer of care from a thoughtful employer. The baby in the crib spat out his pacifier with a wet pop. It landed near his shoulder, sticky with saliva. Before Marisol could move, I picked it up, cradling it in my hand. "I'll rinse this," I said. "Do you have a spare?" "In the drawer." She turned back to the other twin, fastening the last tab on his diaper, trusting me with the kind of easy assumption that made what I was about to do feel both necessary and cruel. In the small ensuite bathroom, I closed the door halfway. Not enough to be suspicious, just enough to be private. I took a small plastic evidence envelope from my pocket, the kind conservation labs used for fiber samples, and slipped the pacifier inside, careful not to touch the nipple again. The saliva smeared against the clear surface, indisputable. My heart pounded, not from fear of being caught, but from the stark reality of what this meant. DNA. Proof. The thing Brian had never expected anyone in this house to seek. I ran the water, letting it splash noisily into the sink for show, then opened a new pacifier from the sealed package I'd brought with me. It was identical to the others. Same brand, same color. I wet it lightly, then carried it back into the nursery, wrapped in a small towel. "Here we go," I said, offering it to Marisol. She took it, grateful. "Gracias." I watched as she settled it into the baby's mouth, his face relaxing instantly. He had Brian's jawline, softened by infancy. The sight made something twist darkly inside me. "I'll have the agency call you tomorrow," I told her. "And if anyone gives you trouble about the extra help, you tell them to talk to me." Her gaze met mine, searching again, as if trying to locate the woman who had promised in the kitchen to take care of him. Maybe she wondered if I'd meant it. Maybe she was hoping I had. "I will," she said finally. When I left the nursery, the envelope felt weightless in my pocket, out of proportion to the leverage it contained. Downstairs, past the gallery walls and the rooms where Brian conducted his empire, I imagined a different kind of lab, clinical, cold, decisive, waiting to turn this small, stolen object into a verdict. Art had taught me to respect provenance, the chain of ownership that proved where a piece came from. Now I was building a provenance of blood. He thought the twins were his secret. They were about to become my evidence. Anita arrived on a Thursday, as if malice could be scheduled. The staff snapped into a sharper version of their usual efficiency, polishing surfaces that were already spotless, arranging flowers that had been arranged an hour before. I waited in the foyer the way Brian liked, centered on the marble, a living, welcome piece. "Clara, darling," she said, stepping from the car in her camel coat, pearls sharp against her throat. Her kiss grazed my cheek like something medicinal. "You look rested." "Good to see you, Anita," I replied. "How was the flight?" "Oh, tedious. But it's worth it too. Check on my favorite couple." Her hand rested on my arm, a touch meant to read as affectionate. Her eyes had already scanned my dress, my hair, my bare left wrist. "No new bracelet? Brian is slipping." Brian laughed as he came around the car to hug her. "She has more jewelry than events to wear it to, Mom. Don't encourage her." We moved inside, the choreography familiar. Staff taking coats, driver disappearing, Anita pausing to appraise the fresh artwork in the hallway. "You've made changes," she noted. "This piece is interesting." "It's a loan from the museum," I said. "Spanish Baroque, late period." "How fitting," she replied smoothly. "You've always been drawn to old things." We settled in the sitting room with tea that no one really wanted. Anita took the chair that faced the window, queening herself without effort. Brian dropped onto the sofa beside me, stretching his arm along the back like a claim. "So," she began, voice light. "How are you really, Clara? Still keeping busy with your restoration hobby?" "It's not a hobby," Brian cut in, amused. "She likes to pretend she's still working." I smiled as if it didn't sting. "I consult for the museum twice a week," I said. "They value my expertise." "Of course they do, dear." Anita's tone was syrupy. "It's good to have something to occupy you while Brian handles the heavier burdens." Her hand fluttered toward him, a benediction. Then she shifted the conversation to the gala, to donors, to the twins' baptism plans. She complimented my dress, my calm presence, my unflappable nature. Every praise was a tiny box with a lock on it. When the house quieted that evening, she found us in the library. I was seated on the sofa with a book open, Brian by the bar, pouring scotch. "You've done wonders with this room," she said. "It almost feels civilized." "Thank you," I replied. "We wanted it to honor your family's history." "Yes, well, some histories are worth honoring." She glanced at my empty wine glass. "More?" "I'm fine, thank you." She crossed to Brian, accepting her drink from his hand. Her posture shifted just enough to angle her back toward me, her face toward him. To anyone else, it would have looked casual. To me, it was staging. "Es tan dulce," she murmured, Spanish slipping like silk into the space between them. Sentada ahí sin idea de lo que pasa a su alrededor. She's so sweet, sitting there with no idea what's happening around her. I turned a page in my book, eyes steady on the text. Brian's mouth curved. "Le hace la vida más fácil," he answered. "She makes life easier." "Como un buen adorno," Anita said, "like a good decoration." The words traced hot lines under my skin. I lifted my gaze just enough to catch her reflection in the glass of the bookcase. Her smile was razor bright, her eyes watching me, indirectly, searching for the slightest flicker of comprehension. I gave her none. Instead, I let my lips curve into the same pleasant smile I'd worn at our wedding reception. "What are you two conspiring about over there?" I asked in English, tone light. "Nothing at all," Brian replied, crossing back to press a kiss to the top of my head. "Just telling Mom how lucky I am." "Yes," Anita agreed. "We were saying how perfectly you fit here. You don't complicate things." Her gaze held mine now, openly curious. "I do my best to make life easier," I said. "For everyone." Her lashes lowered, just a fraction. A test, noted and filed. "Bueno," she said quietly, almost under her breath. "Que siga así." "Good. Let it stay that way." I met her eyes and let a hint of warmth, of gratitude, soften my expression, as if I hadn't understood a word. As if I were exactly what she believed. Ornamental, harmless, deaf to the language of real decisions. Inside, something sharpened. She thought her scorn was safe, wrapped in syllables I couldn't hear. She thought I was furniture. I smiled wider, the picture of graciousness, and raised my glass in a small, invisible toast. To underestimation, to fluent silence, to the day I would answer her in the language she thought belonged only to her blood. The church glittered in a way churches probably shouldn't. Crystal vases lined the aisle, spilling white roses and orchids, their scent thick under the vaulted ceiling. The Sewell Foundation had sponsored the restoration of the stained glass windows. And today, the sunlight poured through them in jeweled shards, bathing the baptismal font in saintly light and discreet wealth. I stood near the front, hands folded, the picture of composed godmother not mother. Brian moved easily between pews, shaking hands, laughing softly with board members and distant cousins who all pretended not to know why there were two bassinets instead of one. Anita floated beside the priest, lips pursed in pious satisfaction. The twins wore miniature linen suits, their dark curls smoothed with water that wasn't holy yet. Marisol hovered behind them, just outside the frame of every photograph, like a shadow no one wanted to acknowledge. "Ready?" Brian murmured as he slipped to my side. "Always," I said. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of Latin and practiced reverence. Names were announced, Sebastian Ignacio and Mateo Luis Sewell, and repeated with appropriate solemnity. There were chuckles when one twin grabbed the priest's vestment, fond smiles when the other yawned through his blessing. Cameras clicked. Somewhere, a PR team would already be drafting the caption. When it was over, the guests flowed into the reception hall attached to the church, a space transformed by candlelight and money. Champagne flutes waited on silver trays. A quartet played something soft and tasteful. At the center of the room, a microphone stood beside a towering cake adorned with tiny sugar doves. "Clara," Anita said, gliding toward me, "we thought it would be appropriate for you to offer a few words. You've become so important to the boys." There it was, the public role, the sanctioned script. I smiled as if touched. "Of course." Brian's hand brushed the small of my back, guiding me forward. "You'll be perfect," he said, with the careless confidence of a man who believed he'd edited every possible outcome. I took the microphone. The room hushed, the way rooms do when a beautiful woman with a famous last name is about to speak. "Thank you all for being here," I began, my voice carrying easily. "Today is a celebration of new life, of family, of legacy." The usual words. Everyone relaxed. "I stand here as someone who married into the Sewell name," I continued. "I've spent years learning what that legacy means. Responsibility, generosity, truth." A few heads tilted at that last word. I let my gaze move over the crowd. Donors, partners, relatives, all dressed in variations of power and pretense. Then I shifted my focus to the front row, where Anita sat with Brian beside her, the twins' bassinets close enough to touch. "And I also stand here," I said, "as someone who has listened, carefully, even when people thought I couldn't understand." A soft ripple moved through the room, the kind that follows an unexpected note. I smiled, letting it bloom slowly. "Hoy quiero honrar a esta familia de la manera más honesta posible." Today, I want to honor this family in the most honest way possible. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. The Spanish rolled out of me clean and sure, years of secret practice sliding into place. Eyes widened. Glass stems tightened in hands. Anita's back went rigid. "He escuchado sus oraciones," I went on. "I have heard your prayers. Sus conversaciones en pasillos y bibliotecas. Sus planes para estos niños maravillosos. Your conversations in hallways and libraries. Your plans for these wonderful children." Brian's face lost its color, then regained it in an angry flush. "Clara," he said sharply under his breath, "what are you doing?" I didn't look at him. "Muchos de ustedes no saben," I said, voice still gentle, "que estos gemelos no son solo una bendición, sino también un secreto. Many of you don't know that these twins are not just a blessing, but also a secret." Somewhere near the back, a guest gasped. The priest shifted uneasily. I switched back to English with surgical precision. "A secret about paternity, about power, about what happens when a man believes language can hide his sins." Brian stepped forward, but Anita caught his wrist, nails digging in. Her eyes were fixed on me, stunned, calculating. "I learned Spanish to honor my grandmother," I said, letting the truth anchor me. I kept it private, intimate, until the night my husband told his mother, in Espanol, that the Maid'S twins would be the new Sewell heirs, and that I would never know. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. No one moved. I nodded toward the bassinets. These boys deserve more than to start their lives as a scandal whispered behind closed doors. They deserve truth. Their mother deserves it. And so do I. I felt the weight of the envelope in my clutch, the lab's logo pressed against my palm like a seal. In my hand, I said calmly, is the DNA confirmation that what Brian and Anita planned in secret is real. That these children are his. That the money funneled through shell companies and fake art acquisitions was not philanthropy, but hush money. The murmur rose, sharp and incredulous. I looked at Brian then, finally, and saw something raw and unfamiliar in his face. Fear. Today is a holy day, I finished. So consider this my own small act of consecration. We wash lies away, too. I lowered the microphone. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the thin, insistent cry of one of the twins, cutting through the stunned silence like a judgment no one could ignore. The conference room had been designed for intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a table long enough to seat a small government, the city spread out below like something Brian owned. His attorneys flanked him in suits that probably came with their own NDAs. Mine sat beside me, a woman with kind eyes and a sharper mind, but this part was mine to conduct. Brian lounged at the head of the table, tie loose, expression wounded in that careful, camera-ready way. "Clara," he began, voice soft, "we don't have to do this like enemies. You're hurt, I get it. You misunderstood some things, and my mother." "I understood every word," I said. "In 2 languages." His jaw flexed. One of his lawyers cleared his throat. "Mrs. Sewell, emotions are running high. Public scenes like the baptism can skew perception. My client is willing to be generous if we can avoid further misinterpretations." Generous. There it was again. I opened the leather portfolio in front of me. The air seemed to thin. "Let's start with facts," I said, "not interpretations." I slid the first document across the table. Corporate registration for Serrano Holdings. "Your shell company," I continued, "formed 6 months before the twins were born. No employees, no physical office, just a routing point for money you didn't want associated with your own name." Brian didn't look down. "Many high-net-worth individuals use holding companies. It's standard practice." "Of course." I nodded. "Standard practice for legal assets." The next sheet followed, a ledger of wire transfers to the gallery. Except these acquisitions never arrived. No bills of lading, no insurance entries, no conservation notes. I checked your storage facility. The Untitled Blue series you paid $380,000 for doesn't exist. One of his attorneys shifted, scanning the page. "There may be a delay in shipment." "There isn't." I laid down glossy color prints of the warehouse inventory, each shelf neatly labeled. "Your own insurer confirmed it in writing." I let that sink in, then added the screenshots. Monthly payments from Serrano Holdings to Marisol's personal account, dressed up as auxiliary curatorial services. "This is not philanthropy," I said. "It's undisclosed compensation, routed through a company that pretends to buy art so your board, your investors, and your mother never see child support on a balance sheet." Brian finally snapped. "You have no idea how these things work. You've looked at a few spreadsheets and decided you're an expert. This is why we had a prenup, to protect the business from your impulses." Gaslighting. Right on cue. If I hadn't spent years restoring paintings warped by smoke and time, I might have believed him. Instead, I slid the final folder forward. "This isn't my analysis," I said. "It's his." The forensic accountant's report was dense, ruthless, and beautifully precise. Flow charts of funds looping through shell entities, emails between junior staffers nervously flagging unusual transactions tied to Serrano Holdings, internal memos recommending verbal-only discussions regarding the domestic situation. My attorney tapped one paragraph. "This section alone," she said calmly, establishes a pattern of intentional misrepresentation to shareholders and the IRS. Combined with the personal spending hidden as corporate expenses, we're not just talking marital misconduct anymore. We're talking criminal exposure. Brian's color drained. "You wouldn't," he said to me low. "You would burn everything down, including your own lifestyle, your reputation?" "You already did," I answered. "I'm just bringing in the fire marshal." Silence stretched. Outside the glass, the city traffic moved unaware. "You want money?" He tried again, grasping for higher ground. "This is about revenge and a bigger check." "This is about accuracy," I corrected. "Our prenup assumed good faith. You voided it when you turned fraud into a line item." I folded my hands, steady. "Here's how this goes, Brian. You negotiate a settlement that reflects your real net worth, not the sanitized version. You set up a legitimate trust for the twins that doesn't require Marisol to live in fear. You keep your board and the DA out of this, because I keep this file in my lawyer's office instead of on a prosecutor's desk." "And if I don't?" he asked, though his voice already knew the answer. I met his eyes, the way I once did when evaluating whether a painting was worth saving. "Then the next room like this won't be about divorce," said. "It will be about indictments." The attorney to his left murmured something urgent in his ear. The one on his right nodded grimly, already calculating damage control. Brian looked at me. Really looked, perhaps for the first time, without assuming he knew the limits of my language, my intelligence, my threshold. "This is extortion," he whispered. "This is evidence," I replied. "You just don't like the frame." He glanced down at the pages spread before him, his careful architecture of lies, rendered in black and white. And something in his posture collapsed by a degree only someone who'd memorized him would notice. "What do you want?" he asked. The number, the properties, the conditions were already written in the term sheet my attorney slid across the table. But what I wanted wasn't on paper. "To walk away," I said, "without you owning a single piece of me you didn't earn." The light in Seville did not behave like light in New York. It poured instead of fell, spilling over the sandstone facades and tiled balconies, catching on the edges of wrought iron railings until everything shimmered as if brushed with gold leaf. I sat at a small table in the Plaza de la Alfalfa, a cup of café con leche cooling between my hands, and watched the city move around me like a painting finally taken out of storage. The barista had addressed me in Spanish without hesitation when I ordered, when I had answered without flinching. No one here was surprised that I understood. No one lowered their voice or changed languages to step around me. I was simply another woman in sunglasses and a linen dress, hair pulled back, paperwork in her toady and son on her shoulders. On the table, my phone buzzed with a new email. The subject line bore my new studio's name, Estudio Peter's Restauración, followed by the word contrato. The museum in Madrid had approved the partnership, complete with a schedule of incoming works that needed conservation. Velázquez School, anonymous altarpieces, a portrait blackened by time and neglect. I didn't open the attachment yet. I let the knowledge sit, warm and solid, like a coin in my pocket. Work was waiting. Not favors arranged by a husband, not token roles, but contracts signed with my own name, secured by my own leverage. All of it funded by a settlement wired in neat installments from accounts that no longer frightened me. Across the plaza, two women argued amiably over a market stall display, their Spanish quick and bright. I caught every word, every tease, every affectionate insult. There was no sting in understanding now, only the pleasure of fluency that belonged solely to me. My passport, tucked in my bag, was newly stamped. The Sewell last name still appeared on it. Legal machinery moved slowly. But my life no longer revolved around it. The deed for my rented studio listed me as Clara Peters. The lease for the apartment above a narrow street in Santa Cruz did too. In time, the rest of the paperwork would catch up. A little girl chased pigeons past my table, shrieking with laughter. Her mother called after her, "Vuelve aquí, traviesa," and the girl spun around, grinning. The words brushed against me like a familiar melody, unthreatening, unhidden. I thought of the library curtain, of Anita's tilted head and Brian's lazy certainty, of Marisol's shaking hands and the twins' soft curls. I had carried all of them with me across an ocean, not as weights, but as reminders carved into bone. Proof of what I'd survived, of what silence had cost us. The church bells began to ring somewhere out of sight, marking the hour. I took out a small notebook, the kind I used to keep my grandmother's recipes in, and wrote a single line at the top of a fresh page in Spanish. Hoy hablo porque quiero, no porque debo. Today, I speak because I want to, not because I have to. The sentence looked right in this language, under this sun. A waiter passed, and I caught his attention with a small lift of my hand. "Perdón," I said easily. "Me trae otro café?" "Could you bring me another coffee?" "Claro que sí," he replied. "Of course, claro." The word wrapped around my name, my future, my choice. As he walked away, I leaned back in my chair, tilted my face toward the sky, and let the warmth soak in. No one was watching to see if I smiled correctly. No one was measuring my worth in airs or appearances. The only legacy in front of me was the one I would restore with my own hands. For the first time in years, when I opened my mouth, the only person I needed to protect or expose was myself. And I had no intention of ever keeping it shut again. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.